A warm kia ora koutou katoa. It is my pleasure to welcome Prime Minister Morrison to Auckland today. It is great to have you back on Kiwi soil, Prime Minister. I'd like to open by acknowledging today is the 8th anniversary of the second Canterbury earthquake. 185 lives were lost, and one of those an Australian. We remember those people today and are reminded of the ongoing grief for their families. When natural disaster strikes, we get by with help from our friends. And after the Canterbury earthquake, Australian support was fast and hugely important to us. 600 Australian emergency service workers assisted with recovery efforts. People in Christchurch will recall the Australian police officers sworn in with New Zealand policing powers, who worked alongside their Kiwi colleagues to reassure locals and support order. New Zealand has no better friend and no greater ally than Australia. Our economies are amongst the most integrated in the world, with significant trade and investment flows, and we are stronger together on the international stage. But our relationship transcends the normal dealings of government, and like most of our international relationships, Australia is family in every sense of the word. We've always had a special bond that continues to benefit both our countries, and that, I believe, will only expand given the intertwined nature of our societies. Today, PM Morrison and I enjoyed a very friendly and very useful discussion during our annual leaders' meeting. We covered a whole range of issues, including the dynamic opportunities from running an ambitious trans-Tasman single economic market agenda, our shared interests in the region, and our shared neighbourhood in the Pacific. As in any family, it's inevitable that occasionally we'll see things differently. Prime Minister Morrison and I have discussed some of the areas where we do not have the same starting point, and I feel we have a pretty good understanding of each other's perspectives. We did have a very frank discussion about New Zealanders who have made their homes in Australia and how they can be given every opportunity to thrive while living there. We also talked about deportations of New Zealanders. In my view, this issue has become corrosive in our relationship over time. I made it clear that New Zealand has no issue with Australia taking a dim view of newly arrived non-citizens committing crimes. But equally, the New Zealand people have a dim view of the deportation of people who moved to Australia as children and have grown up there, with often little or no lasting connection to here. I'm sure it is a matter that we will continue to discuss. In last year's meeting, we said we'd look for innovative ways to create a more seamless economic environment, and we've done a lot since that time. We said New Zealand would match Australia's removal of departure cards, and we've done that, making trans-Tasman travel faster and easier. We commissioned work on how to advance the digital economy and maximise opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses. Our productivity commissions have delivered a report, and we are now looking at how to implement some of those key findings. We announced a city symposium, and our respective ministers are hosting this next week in Sydney. We said we'd work together to make e-invoicing possible to both our countries. And today we are announcing the creation of Australia-New Zealand Electronic Invoicing Board and the interoperability framework we will jointly adopt. Implementing e-invoicing across business and government will drive savings of over $30 billion over 10 years across two countries. I'm sure we are both looking forward to our meeting this afternoon with business leaders to talk about what more we can do, and we talked about some of those already. Ideas such as improving SMEs' cash flow, we know cash is king when you're a small business, work towards mutual recognition of digital identity, and so on. I'd like to finish, though, by saying again how much I've enjoyed the time that we've spent together today, Prime Minister Morrison. I'm sure Clark and Jenny have enjoyed their time together as well. In fact, Clark has already, I've seen, just sent me an image of the wonderful gift you've given Neve. And can I say she is a very lucky and very spoiled child. So I thank you for that. And I look forward to the next Prime Ministerial meetings in due course, and of course any opportunity we have to engage in dialogue in between time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister. Kia ora. It's wonderful to be here back in New Zealand for both Jenny and I want to thank the Prime Minister and Clark for your very warm welcome, and I'm getting similar reports back from Jen as well. She's loving being back here today. And I just want to also begin by acknowledging that this is a significant day for all New Zealanders and all of those who were touched by the terrible earthquake 8 years ago. It shook New Zealand, literally, but it shook Australians as well in a very different way. And the 500 police officers who turned up at a moment's notice, I think, was a great demonstration of the relationship that exists between Australia and New Zealand. It is very much like this. It's hard to see where one finishes and the other starts between our two countries. It's beyond politics. It's even beyond sport on occasion. It's beyond all of these things. And that's why these meetings are so important. That's why it was so important to me to be here today. It's a big year in Australia, as we know, elections on, budgets to prepare, but this is an important relationship, as are all of our relationships throughout the Pacific. And it was in the context of reflecting on those very difficult days all those years ago in Christchurch that we reflected on the many other disasters that have been occurring more lately. And I express my thanks to those brave New Zealand firefighters who've been fighting alongside our firefighters in Tasmania over our summer, and thank them very much. They have very specialist skills to go into wilderness heritage areas and to be able to fight those fires, and we thank them very much for their bravery and their skills, and they've made a big difference. We also discussed today the lessons that we can learn post-disaster, whether it's from 8 years ago, whether it's from 10 years ago with the Black Saturday fires in Victoria, or indeed the lessons that are being put into practice now in Australia and North Queensland, whether it's on the coast in Townsville or inland in northwest Queensland, where we are suffering terrible losses to our cattle and livestock industry in that part of the country. But equally down in Victoria, where the drought has further encroached into places like Gippsland, where they've seen fires. All of these require not just immediately dealing with the event, but the recovery program that follows, and we've agreed today that our teams will do further work on how we do the response on the other side of disasters and learn the lessons from those. A $30 billion boost to our collective economies comes from the initiatives we're talking about today, whether it's the e-invoicing or the other measures to ensure we totally embrace the economic opportunities from the digital economy. I cannot think of two other national economies more integrated than Australia's and New Zealand's. Our banking system, our financial systems, all of these are closely integrated. And that means there are bigger opportunities to yield big economic dividends by further cooperation, and the measures that we've been working on, I think, demonstrate that. I also want to thank Prime Minister Ardern and her government for their leadership on their Pacific Reset program. It works hand in glove with our Pacific Step Up program. Both of these programs, in my moving around the region, and I'm sure also Prime Minister Ardern's, have been well received, because the Pacific is family, whether it's whānau or whether it's vavale or whatever term is applied, wherever you might be, that's what it's about. We want to see a sovereign, independent, strong Pacific with all of those Pacific Island nations, and between New Zealand and Australia, they will not find a more friendly family partnership than with both of our nations, and it has been good to talk about those. And finally, can I once again thank New Zealand for their participation, together with Australia and the other allies, in what we're doing in the Middle East. In Iraq, together, we have trained 42,000 Iraqis to make their country safer and more secure, and that has come from those we've asked to go and serve in our name and train those who need our help to restore their country. And I think that's something Australians and New Zealanders can be very proud of, the work that our men and women who serve in our Defence Forces have done there. I met them just before Christmas, and I met a few of the Kiwis too. And the way they work together and respect they have for each other just reflects the relationship that we've spoken of. So thank you very much, and happy to participate in the question process.
Thank you, Prime Ministers. We'll now take questions from the floor. Katie from TVNZ.
Hi. To both Prime Ministers, Mike Pompeo has said today that the US won't partner or share information with any countries that do dealings with Huawei. Does this mean it's not possible for our governments to use them? Did you discuss taking a united approach to sharing info, etc.?
I think actually, the nature of our discussions often prefaced by the fact that we have our own processes and systems, and we, of course, make our own decisions based on our own national interest and based on our own independent foreign policy. And I'd say that is the case regardless of whatever the foreign policy or national security matter will be. Of course, we are close friends and allies. We talk frequently. We are both, part of Five Eyes. But ultimately, what determines our position on issues around national security will always be in our nationally determined position. On Huawei, of course, you well know that our process is governed by TICSA. We are still in the middle of that process. At the moment, the option of mitigation sits with Spark, and that's who the GCSB deal directly with. And as I've always said, we of course are aware of other countries' positions, but our position is our own.
I would only concur. We have different processes, but we arrived at similar decisions in our own independent way. In fact, it was a decision I took as Treasurer last year, consistent with our own legislation and our own national interests. So we will take those decisions in our own interests and work with those who share an outlook on these matters. But it's also important to note, as we discussed today, that I think, and forgive me if I sort of join New Zealand in saying this, but I know you won't disagree, we both welcome China's economic development. We think that's a good thing, and we want to see that continue because it's meant a lot for our economies as well. So we welcome the growth in the Chinese economy. We're heavily integrated. They are Australia's single largest trading partner, and our free trade agreement with China has been one of the most significant elements of the expansion of our trading opportunities as a nation in decades. And so we welcome their growth, we welcome their strength in their economy, and we would only encourage that. But as with all things, every country has to make judgments in their own interests, and both Australia and New Zealand have always done that.
Cool. Renee from the Courier Mail.
Hello, Prime Minister. There are no families or women on Manus Island, only single men. Some of them have some serious security issues, as we're finding out, have found out in recent days. Australian Department officials have not denied that New Zealand officials have said New Zealand does not want to take any single men from Manus Island. What is your position on taking single men from Manus Island? And Prime Minister, can I get an update from you as well on the security issues in relation to some of those asylum seekers on Manus Island?
I welcome the question from the Courier Mail and the opportunity to correct the record. We've been utterly consistent. UNHCR themselves, of course, in the way that they work through with refugees, does place some priority on women and children. And of course, that was something that we acknowledged and shared. It was never, however, the case that our offer across Manus and Nauru was solely around women and children. But of course, we acknowledged the special need that existed there in the same way that the UNHCR does. That's the first point. The second point is that, of course, New Zealand will apply its own rigour around that process as well. We are simply not benign recipients of individual refugees. We have a role to play in ensuring that our national security is protected at the same time.
Well, it's true. Every country has to decide the circumstances in which people come to their country. And my only regret is that in the Australian Parliament in the last week that our ability to do that was compromised by the bill that passed the Parliament. On Manus Island, it is true that the only people are there are single males. And we're aware that there are quite a number there who, if you would apply the normal character test that applies to all other persons who would seek to come to Australia, whether they're a student, a visitor or anything else, you wouldn't allow them in. And that is why we are concerned about what passed the Parliament last week because it compromises our ability to prevent the transfer of people who would otherwise not pass that test. But whether it's certainly with the United States, where we have an arrangement where more than 450 people have already been transferred to the United States, and as you know, the last 4 children who are on Nauru already have their bags packed, ready to go to the United States. That remaining cohort of people, whether it's on Nauru or Manus, is around about the 1,000 mark. The majority of those are on Manus Island. The process of engaging with the United States will continue, and many are still engaged in that process, but ultimately it's up to the United States who they decide to take and who they don't. They are no more a passive participant in that process than anyone else would be. When it comes to the New Zealand arrangement, it's something we touch on every time we're here. The Australian government has no plans to take up that arrangement whatsoever, and that is particularly now more pertinent on the basis of what happened in the Parliament last week. That, I think, now makes that even more difficult than it was before. And we weren't taking it up before, but that would make it even... We appreciate the offer. I should stress it's been made by successive governments in New Zealand. We appreciate the friendliness of the offer and its genuineness. But in terms of Australia's security interests and how we manage our borders, we don't believe it's consistent with that, particularly now after what happened in the Parliament last week.
Given the issues with Australian coal coming into northern Chinese ports, does that point to a souring of the relationship with China? And could there be kickback for New Zealand in our exports of kiwi fruit, milk powder and meat?
Well, no is the short answer to the question. I think people should be careful about leaping to conclusions about this. This is not the first time that on occasion local ports make decisions about these matters, and so there is no evidence before me or us that would suggest that it has the connotations that it has anything to do with anything more broadly than that. This happens from time to time, and we just work constructively with our partners in China about those issues. So what we are engaged with, as indeed New Zealand is just pursuing a constructive relationship with China, a very constructive relationship with China. Our coal exports remain our single largest mineral export in Australia. It supports 55,000 jobs in Australia, right across our economy. And our government is certainly in favour of being able to continue to engage in our minerals resource industry to ensure it flourishes, and we would certainly think that if there was any weakening in that market, I certainly wouldn't think it was wonderful. I would think it would be a very serious impact on the Australian economy, and I'd be concerned about it and I would act on it.
Over the last year, actually, our goods exports went up. And in recent times, when there's been some of discussion around New Zealand's relationship and any knock-on effect for exporters, you've heard exporters themselves come out and say that from their perspective, it was business as usual. In fact, we undertook our own assessment. You know, when you do a comparison between any issues, regulatory issues with consignments at the border, of which we have many, last year there were only issues with 0.26% of the time, and in January we only saw it at 0.29% of the time. So there's nothing to suggest that we are seeing any of those impacts on our exporters beyond what you might expect with just regulatory and administrative issues.
Cool. Next question, Stephen from AEC.
Mr. Morrison, thanks for the question. Can I ask you, you refer to the problem with those 5 northern ports and Australian coal exports as a regulatory problem, I gather, rather than a political decision.
Well, there's nothing to suggest otherwise.
Have you sought assurances from the Chinese government, or has DFAT sought assurances from the Chinese government that that is the case? And if it is a regulatory issue, do you have any explanation for why it appears that Australian exports have been targeted, but exports from other countries in those ports have not yet been targeted?
Well, no, I can't offer any further comment on what I really said before. These are local decisions that are made, and there is nothing before me to suggest that it would be consistent with any of the conclusions that some are drawing. So, look, I think in these circumstances, my approach is always just to remain very practical about these things. We'll, of course, continue to engage with those local ports and those authorities and work through the same regulatory issues that we've worked through in the past. This isn't the first time this has happened. This is not new. It has occurred before, and there are any number of issues practically that need to be addressed in these circumstances, and that's what we'll do.
Cool. And Barry
Prime Minister Morrison, some may not be aware here that, in fact, you lived in Wellington for a couple of years. About 20 years ago, you're the head of the Tourism and Sport Office. And in that capacity, of course, you developed a slogan, 100% New Zealand pure.
Well, George Hickton did, yeah.
I beg your pardon?
George Hickton did, yeah.
Yeah, well, you were involved in it, as I understand.
It was a great period of time.
I'm just wondering whether that slogan would apply to what the Prime Minister said was a corrosive part of our relationship, and that is sending people that are classified as Kiwis in Australia, if they've committed a crime, back to New Zealand when they've had about as much association with New Zealand as Barnaby Joyce did.
Well, the simple answer is this. Australia has very well-defined immigration and citizenship laws, and our government has taken a very strong line, and when it comes to those who are in Australia, who are on visas. See, visas are not citizenship. Visas are provided on the basis of people being compliant with those visas, and that doesn't include committing crimes. And so we take a very strong view about this. It is a view that is not restricted to New Zealand, I should stress, and I understand that New Zealand understands that this is not targeted at New Zealand in any way, shape or form. As Immigration Minister, I made many such decisions and with people who were deported back to the United Kingdom and other parts of the world. So we do have a very strong view on this. We do maintain very strict rules around our immigration in Australia. It's always been a hallmark of our government and governments like us. And we might not always agree in these meetings, as Prime Minister Ardern has said, but I can tell you we always do listen, and I think that's an important part of the relationship. And we will seek to manage these issues sensitively, but at the same time, Australia will always be a country under my government which will treat the seriousness of the integrity of our immigration system very, very deeply.
So there's no chance of relaxation with this?
Well, we'll work through individual cases sensitively.
Primrose from the Australian.
Thank you so much. So my first question is to Prime Minister Ardern. What have you learnt, if anything, from how Australia handled pressure from China in the current diplomatic issues you're having with Beijing? And to both Prime Ministers, are you open to Japan and Germany either joining the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance or cooperating with them further?
On the second matter, that's not something I've given individual consideration to, and I don't think it would be anything that would be considered at an individual level, but rather as a collective of Five Eyes. On the first matter, look, we're close friends and allies. There's no doubt that we observe one another's international diplomacy, issues of national security. And so I have made observations around, of course, some of the decisions that have been made previously, but I think probably the point that I'd like to still place emphasis on is that none of that changes the nature of our own decision-making or ultimately our own decisions. They are merely observations.
I would agree with Prime Minister Ardern's response on the second matter, but I'd also say this, that we work closely with both countries, whether it's on, and particularly when it comes to our region, and particularly Japan. And Prime Minister Ardern and I, when we were in Papua New Guinea at the APEC summit, we were there with the Americans and the Japanese, and we were engaged in the most transformational project you could probably imagine in PNG, the electrification of the nation of Papua New Guinea. I mean, this is a game changer of human development and opportunity that, frankly, I haven't seen in my lifetime to have the opportunity to participate in. And Prime Minister Abe is such an excited participant in this. As we continue to work with our family in the Pacific, we see a real opportunity for both countries to draw in the support of our friends and partners all around the world, which can include China, to see the realisation of the opportunity of the Pacific peoples. We feel deeply about this as nations, and where we can work with other countries to realise their independence, their future, well, we will be happy leaders of that process.